All right, let's get into what happened up at the NovaCare complex today as the Eagles, it looks like, John, they're going to be without Malik Jackson, Liz Frank injury, so that means we touched on it yesterday, but he'll be gone for the rest of the season. How big of an impact is that on their defense now knowing that he's going to be done?
Yeah, pretty big impact. I mean, this is a guy they brought in as a significant free agent pickup. I think they were very excited about what he brought to the defense, about his ability to take some of the I don't want to say double teams because people are going to double team Fletcher Cox, but he would have the ability to take advantage of that, and that's gone. And he's a very unique player. I always talk about because he's 6'5". He's very lengthy. You typically don't see that with defensive tackles. So from a pass rushing standpoint, he created a lot of issues for the opposition. And the Eagles are pretty deep. I think the hope is Tim Jernigan is healthy. If he's healthy, they'll be fine. But that's kind of a big if because really the first 6 games of 2017, I mean, if you can remember back that way, they were pretty impressive with Fletcher and Tim Jernigan in there. Then the injuries kind of took over, and last year was an entire washout with the herniated disc. But the hope is he's healthy, and if he's healthy, I think they'll be fine. But that's still a big if, and yeah, it hurts. I mean, anytime you lose a good player, and that's what Malik is, but that's what this league is, and that's what Jim Schwartz said today. It happens to everybody. Happens all over the league. Eagles know it's going to happen at some point. It's unfortunate that you lose a player like that after one game.
Well, we know the Eagles had a bunch of guys in a training camp at the defensive tackle spot. They ended up, trading Trayvon Hester or releasing Hester. The Redskins picked him up. They brought a guy, Ridgeway, in. What are some of the backup options, or do you think they might go outside the organization, or do they maybe utilize some of their ends more in that role? What is the plan moving forward? What are some of the possible plans moving forward? I know they don't come out and say, well, this is who we're signing and this is what we're doing, but what are some of the options?
They were actually working out defensive linemen today at the NovaCare complex, so we'll see. But obviously, if you're on the street at this point, it's not going to be significant. 2 names you have to keep an eye on are Jernigan and Hassan Ridgeway. They move up sort of a tick each, so Tim becomes the starter. Ridgeway becomes the most significant reserve. And then, as you mentioned, that's one of the positives. It's that Brandon Graham specifically and Vinny Curry also, they have some experience kicking inside and nickel packages. So they can help out and with reps, at least in key passing situations. So they do have some versatility. They do have some depth. It would be nice to still have Trayvon Hester, but as you mentioned, he's gone. He's in Washington. They do have Bruce Hector back, though. He's on the practice squad, and he could be elevated.
You know, John, something we talked about yesterday on the show, and I want your thoughts on this. We talked about how the offense really obviously showed up in the second half and won that game for the Eagles, but are we overlooking this defense at all? Do they have what it takes to possibly do that for the team later in the season? Can they do enough to win this team a game or 2 or 3 or whatever it may be? Did maybe any weaknesses or areas of concern for you get covered up or overlooked in the Week 1 win against the Redskins?
Yeah, I mean, Jim was not happy today, so that's number one. I don't think the defense performed up to his standards. A lot of people don't know this, and we always talk about for some reason because they don't like the style of defense that people don't like Jim in this defense, particularly the Eagles in the Jim Schwartz era, which is obviously the same as Doug Peterson era, coming into that game, allowed the fewest points per game at home in the entire NFL. So generally they're pretty good at home playing defense. They were not good against the Redskins. And I think a lot of it has to do with guys coming back. Fletcher Cox was not typically Fletcher Cox. He's not nearly himself yet. Nigel Bradham played the whole game, did not play well. Ronald Darby, Jim today mentioned he was very upset with the coverage as a whole. And that was Darby, that was Douglas, that was Sidney Jones, that was basically everybody. So I think at some point they're going to have the ability to win a game or two. But early it could be a struggle because so many guys are working their way back from injuries.
You mentioned the snap count with Nigel Bradham playing 100% of the snaps, all 67, I believe, was the amount of snaps on defense. Any surprises for you there? Who saw the field more than you expected, least, and how will that change moving forward?
Well, no, I mean, Nigel's the only three-down linebacker, so our only question there, well, there were two questions. A, could he play the entire game because he's coming off the toe surgery? That was one. Two, would they suspend him or penalize him a little bit for missing the Jets game in the preseason? So, in other words, would they bench him for a series? Would they bench him for a quarter? They didn't. So he's the one three-down linebacker. He played the entire game. They played a ton of big nickel. That's three safeties with Malcolm sort of playing linebacker in essence and Andrew Sendeo coming in. The rotation, Fletcher didn't play as much as he usually does. And Jim talked about the cornerback rotation. Some of it had to do with Ronald coming back. Some of it had to do with guys cramping up because it was so hot. But typically corner, you don't want to rotate. And he admitted today he wants to settle that down at some point. How does he get to that point? Ronald's going to be one of them. We know that. But Rasul or Sidney Jones, I mean, we have a lot of Rasul fans, Mike being one of them, as a West Virginia guy, I assume. But we have a lot of Sidney fans. And hey, you shouldn't be a fan of either after that game because neither of them played well.
I will say I like Sidney more than I like Rasul coming in. I mean, I think that he's got more upside, but it'll be interesting to see. How'd you think Maddox played?
He was okay, but he also certainly – I think people are jumping steps with Avonte Maddox because he does show so much promise, but I think people want to get to that final step where he's – whatever, a top 5 slot corner in this league. He's not nearly there yet. You saw Trey Quinn. He's not exactly Julian Edelman. Turned him around a couple times. So I don't think he played as poorly as Sidney or Rasul, but there's room for improvement there as well.
Yeah, talking with John McMullen at JF McMullen here. Let me go real quick back to the Jenkins Malik Jackson thing. And just, we know Howie, do you think that's an option that he would pick up the phone? And, I mean, is it that big of a loss that they might have to do something to get a little bit more talented player? Do you think they are okay with what they have currently in-house?
I think it's going to be really, really hard to find a better player than Tim Jernigan. So I
maybe
mean,
not to replace Jernigan, but maybe as the third guy, because it seemed like they got Jackson and Fletcher, and then brought Jernigan in as kind of like that rotation. It seems that they like to have that third rotational guy. Do you think they need a better third guy?
Well, that's where Ridgeway comes in, and they do like him a lot. He's a little bit of a different player, more of a just a run-stuffing guy. When you say they wanted a three-man rotation, I mean, a lot of it, there was uncertainty surrounding Tim Jernigan. Nobody knew if he was going to be healthy. Nobody thought he was going to re-sign here. So that was sort of, we have Tim, let's see how he is physically. Let's cross our fingers. And if it works out, we got a really, really good rotation. And we got 3 really good players. I'm not sure that was the plan that said we have 3 really good players because there was so much uncertainty with Tim. So you got to be realistic. I mean, you can't have a star at every position. You certainly can't have a star at every backup position. And you are going to have attrition. And that's where guys have to step up. Last year was Trevon Hester. Well, Trevon got cut because he got better, and you think Hassan Ridgeway is better. So, he's the guy who's going to step in. He's supposed to step in, and I think the Eagles have confidence in him.
John, of course, the other thing on the defense that I do want to get your opinion on real quick. You got that linebacker spot, and you mentioned Nigel, just how Bradham kind of fared in the game, and then everybody else around him, because that was a big question mark moving forward, was this linebacking core. Did they handle themselves all right in week one?
No, they did not play well. And really, Nigel's the only one who played. I mean, let's be honest. Zach Brown was in 20-something snaps, so they really only used one linebacker for a significant portion of the game and played, as I mentioned, a lot of three safeties, a lot of big nickel with Malcolm Jenkins essentially playing linebacker. That's what we all expected. That's what happened. I think it will continue to go that way until Camus Hill is healthy and ready to go, and then maybe they lean a little bit more on that second linebacker, and we'll have to see, because Camus was playing well in training camp before he got hurt, but he's hardly a proven player as well. So Jim's got some different ways to go, but I think we've been talking since the spring. I mean, probably talent-wise, linebacker's the least impressive position on this team. The good news from the Eagles' perspective is it's probably the most devalued position on the defensive side of the ball, so it's not as important as it once was.
John, I want to transition to some offensive news, notes, and questions we have for you. Andre Dillard, I think that's interesting, how that's going to play out and where his role fits when you talk about this season. Lane Johnson and Jason Peters, they're healthy now. They played 100% of the snaps in week one. Dillard did see some inline tight end work, very little, but they did find ways to get him on the field. How are we going to see his role shape out the rest of the season?
Hopefully you're not going to see it, an increased role, and that means Jason Peters and Lane Johnson are completely healthy. I mean, you saw that offensive line kind of take over on that 19-play drive, specifically the left side, and Jason Peters, Isaac Sayamala, who I think is much improved. Jason was tremendous. So I think the only concern you have is, can he hold up at his age? And we saw last year. Now, from his perspective, he says, remember, he was coming off a torn ACL as well. So he was sort of in that Carson Wentz boat, didn't feel completely healthy. Now he's a year plus off it, so he does feel healthy. Week one, it was tremendous, as I said. Eagles have a luxury there. They got a first-round pick who doesn't have to play and is not going to play significant snaps unless something happens. But it's nice to have a talent like that if something does happen. So that's where the Eagles are.
All right, transitioning to your favorite position on the offense, the backfield and the running backs. And, the Vikings – I
got some you-know-what about that today.
Of course you did. That's not a surprise to any of us. But the Vikings had some success on the ground. Jordan Howard, I guess that was the shock, if you want to call it that, of week one, only playing 23% of the time, 17 snaps. Could we expect him to be their wild card that they're going to pull out of Doug Peterson's back pocket and say, all right, Howard, you're going to get the workload against the Falcons in week two?
Well, we have no idea. That's the issue I have with this committee. Now, I'm making this clear for everyone. Please listen. Everybody in this league, with the exception of the Carolina Panthers, runs a committee at running back. The committee is not a problem. Forget that word. This committee is a problem because there are no defined roles. So you say he's going to play against the Atlanta Falcons? I don't know. I don't think Doug knows. That's a bit of a joke. He kind of understands. But the point is, from the running back's perspective, and anybody who's ever talked to a running back, and I encourage you to do so, they feel better. They get a groove in the game with more touches. There are no defined roles. That's all I'm saying. You have to define the roles. There has to be a lead back. There has to be a complimentary back. And in the case of the Eagles, because they have Darren Sproles, he's got to be the third down back. That's what has to happen. That's the problem, and it's been a problem for 3+ years.
Interestingly enough, you asked Doug today the question about the running back by committee, and that to not
Oh,
Doug, Mike
Groh.
Groh. Sorry, you asked Mike Groh about Doug Peterson mentioning that certain guys run certain plays, and that how do you sell scout to be careful, with all the analytics and people in the film and everything, not to know a tell, like tip in your hands on something. Did he have an acceptable answer for you on that?
Well, he's very evasive. That's Mike. He's not going to give you a lot. He's not doing it on purpose. But the fact is that Doug says certain guys are good at certain running plays, and that's what we have in the game. So if that's true, that means the opposing defenses are watching. That means very early in the season they'll figure out which running back is in which package and which running play they're going to run. This is just one of the many issues of why this is a goofy way to do things. And for some reason, people have taken a tangent of me, of all people, and you know this, Mike. I think I was the first beat guy here who said Doug's going to be a good coach. It's not a criticism. Overall, Doug Peterson is a very, very good NFL head coach. That doesn't mean he does everything right. And it's kind of ironic to me that people say, well, we're going to default to Doug Peterson. And in the first half, they're booing their heads off, 17-0, saying no preseason. They're criticizing Doug Peterson. I mean, it is not illegal to criticize him. You can question things. And the way he runs this running back room, and even Deuce Staley, who's the position coach, when Deuce was a player, what did he say? I want the football. I want to get into a groove. He hated being a two-headed monster, and at one point there was a three-headed monster here. It's just funny to me.
Yeah.
And
well, look, I mean, anybody who plays that position, I don't think really ever wants to come off the field. I mean, but if you're a running back,
and that's what I said.
Right, I don't want to share carries with you. I want them all for myself, right?
Yeah.
Real quick on that, John. Sorry, we're running a little short. I want to get a couple quick things in here on Minnesota. Ran the ball 40 times against Atlanta. Does that game plan enter into Doug in the mind at all to say, you know what, they found something against this Atlanta team that really worked? Do you anticipate that possibly being a part of the game plan, or is Doug going to say, I'm going to do what I want to do?
No, I don't, but not because Doug's going to do. And I also asked Mike this. I mean, there were so many outliers in that game. They had a block punt early, and they went in from 20 yards out. Then they had good position. Then it was 28-0. And at that point, we always talked about the personality of the game. They just ran the football. They're trying to siphon the clock. Mike Zimmer's an old-school guy. That's why they ran it so much. They only threw it 10 times. It's very, very unlikely those circumstances are going to happen again. So it's going to be a more typical NFL game, and that has nothing to do with Doug's game plan. If the Eagles happen to block a punt and go up 28-0 relatively early, they're probably going to run the football a ton. But it's unlikely that's going to happen 2 weeks in a row.
Quickly, NFL Week 1 last night. Saints, they come back. Great game there. We see that. We've got the Patriots. They're going to get Antonio Brown. That was a huge win for them. They kind of pushed away the Steelers with ease. The Browns got ripped. What were any highlights or standouts from Week 1 in the NFL now that it's all in the books?
Well, I think you hit on two of them. I mean, we'll use Denny Green because everybody was doing it this weekend. People were crowning the Cleveland Browns a little bit too early, especially with a first-time head coach, Freddie Kitchen. There's going to be hiccups there. People should have expected that. And also, after an off-season, people were studying Baker Mayfield. I mentioned on the show before it was going to be more difficult for him. The Patriots, I think at some point if Antonio Brown comes in there and walks the straight and narrow, and that's a big if. But, I think we might have to cancel Miami because we already know who's winning.
That's a 18.5-point road favorite in that game. What do you make of that story that the Dolphins players, you buy into that at all? That the Dolphins players went to their agents and were like, get us out of here, some of these guys?
No. I mean, that was a Pro Football Talk story, Pro Football Talk. So in other words, it's a clickbait story. But Miami Herald did a more in-depth piece. It's more of guys complaining, and that's just natural. If you get waxed like that, you just sort of just talk with your agents and your friends and your family and say, man, I want to get released. I want to get retired. I don't want to go through that. I think some of that happened, but it was more of a gossipy type thing. People aren't seriously saying trade me because, well, A, if you're that bad on that team, who wants to trade for you, number one? And number two, that's just not how this league works. I mean, there's not wholesale trades after week one.
All right, big news today. Malik Jackson out for the rest of the season. Liz Frank injury, and we'll have more on the website. John has it, 97.3 ESPN.com. Follow him at JF McMullen. And we will, of course, do football at 4 again on tomorrow's show. All right, John, take care, man.
All right, thanks, guys.
John McMullen, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.